Good day, listeners. Welcome to another episode of Beyond the Checkbox, where we learn how to integrate more mental wellness into our organizations. And on today's episode, we're talking to Dr. Nicole Letourneau. And this conversation was wild for me because a lot of what we had thought about genetic expression, specifically around mental health and trauma, has been uncovered or changed in recent years. And the big insight for me, well, there's two real insights that I found. One, the pattern of care that you get as a young person between 0 to 5 is so important for the rest of your life, crucially important. Mostly because, and this is the second point, your genetic expressions change over time, and sometimes your genetic code, and she kind of dives into what this looks like and how they're proving this, how genetic expressions change over time. So the things that we do early in our life have a change on the actual genetics of things that we express in our brain, which obviously have an impact on things like resilience. Awesome conversation. Was very lucky to have Dr. Nicole Letourneau into the studio. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. I found it very expansive and interesting. So enjoy the show, and thank you, as always, for watching Beyond the Checkbox. You are listening to Beyond the Checkbox, a podcast that focuses on leading strategies around bringing more mental well-being into the workplace. My name is Ryan Todd. I'm a psychiatrist and the CEO of Adversity. I'm sitting down with industry-leading changemakers to break down their process and see how they are going above and beyond for their workforce mental well-being. What are you finding the most interesting about right now?
Well, in my work, the most interesting thing to me right now is that we're starting to figure out how we can actually change children's gene expression when they've been exposed to stress. Because there's all kinds of evidence, the epigenetic literature, right? That, everyone's born with a genotype and it doesn't change. But our experiences that we have change what genes are expressed, right? And so there's certain genes that are affected by adversity or positive environments, right, more than others. So, and one of the theories about why so many children struggle is that they've had these poor early environments. Your parents have been stressed, they've had depression, they've had violence in the home, they've had low income, they've had addiction issues, and that undermines parents' ability to be sensitive and responsive to children. And sensitivity and responsiveness is what children need for appropriate brain development and even physiological development, like things related to cardiovascular conditions and inflammatory conditions.
When
Believe
you
it or
say
not,
sensitivity and responsiveness, break that down a little more for us.
So I can actually. There's a metaphor that we use to talk about sensitivity and responsiveness, which is serve and return. And it is such a simple idea, but it is so powerful. I don't think people fully appreciate how powerful it is. But when a child serves up a cue, like they make eye contact, like you're making with me, a parent who is sensitive would notice that and recognize their child wants to keep interacting. Okay? Versus if you look away, a sensitive parent would notice that maybe the child needs a break, or there's some kind of change that they need to have happen.
Man. Okay.
And that's a very subtle cue, but the more obvious ones are things like crying. Baby serves up a crying cue, the child needs some help. They need a change. They need the parent to address their needs in some way. So it goes from the very, subtle eye contact or looking away, or to very big cues like crying or that sort of thing.
And everything in between.
And everything in between, yeah. And so sensitive parents responding to those cues, that's exactly what children need in order for their brains to develop optimally. That's brain development and human development happens in the context of relationships, and that's how relationships happen, serve and return interactions, right?
Is it the more responsive, the better?
Mostly.
Like, is there a upper limit or too responsive?
You can be too responsive, because there's also parents need to set limits, and you don't pander to your children. Not every need needs to be met. Sometimes parents, there's part of that whole learning is that sometimes parents have to attend to somebody else, like another child, or make dinner or whatever. And so part of the serve and return is also reacting in a way that lets the child know that, yes, you're important, but this is the thing I have to deal with right now. And your needs are important, and sometimes they supersede all else, but other times there's, they don't. But it's about, so these sort of healthy serve and return interactions, like you're right, there's a whole variety of them, and you can be too responsive. And you can also be too, one of the things that I kind of think a little bit about is a parent who's very controlling of their child is very sensitive and responsive. They really pay attention to their child, but that also can be abusive.
Yeah.
You know, so there are there's, you don't want to take it to extreme, but definitely in general, a parent who is more sensitive and responsive to their children, to their child, is likely to have a child that grows up optimally in terms of brain development and mental health. And things like depression, addictions, family violence undermine that ability to be sensitive and responsive for a whole lot of reasons. Like if you're a depressed mother, the symptoms of depression undermine your sensitivity. You know, just the fatigue and the lack of energy and the low mood. You know, the child is not going to get the kind of sensitivity, responsiveness, or the serve and return is just not likely to be as timely. And same addictions, same kind of thing. You know, if a parent who's on a substance is not likely to be sensitive and responsive to their child, or that sort of thing. So anyway, all that is to say is there's a huge body of evidence that shows that when children grow up in environments where there's less sensitivity and responsiveness, these toxic stressors, we call them depression, violence, addictions, and low income.
Say those again, toxic.
The toxic stressors are considered to be maternal or family depression in the parents, addictions, family violence, and low income. So those.
Wow.
Yeah. So those things,
Holy,
and they often travel
incredible.
together. Yeah, and they often travel together, right? You know.
But the low income thing's really striking.
Mm-hmm.
That poverty plays.
Poverty, and it often goes along with depression, right? People are in these situations they don't want to be in, and they often also end up with addictions because they're managing their mental health because they're stressed with their low income. Like it's quite amazing how they all seem to travel together.
Are they independent contributants to that? Are they independently toxic?
Yes, they are. Yeah, I mean that would be that's what the evidence would tell us, so you can kind of unfortunately like have additive effects when you have multiples of.
But you just have one of those. Let's say you're high income, and you're not depressed, and you're not abusive, but there's addiction in the house. That is independently toxic.
Yes.
Whoa.
Yeah, that's what the evidence shows us.
Yeah.
But there's a sort of a qualifying statement. If that parent has one of these stressors, you know, they're depressed, they have an addiction, but if they are able to manage to be sensitive and responsive to their children in spite of that, that can protect their children's development. So we often say that to parents who are depressed because they don't, you know, depression's a disease. You can't, you know, you just kind of, you get treatment and you hope that you get over it. But while parents are in that state, you know, we have actually some of my own research shows that you can help them to be sensitive and responsive and have these healthy serve and return interactions with their children that'll protect their children's development until, you know, fake it till you make it, until the parent gets over the symptoms of depression, or you know, other parents around, other grandparents, people in the family network can actually step in.
That's what I'm wondering
about. They can step in and help. That definitely helps. That's a protective factor.
It takes a village. What if you have a nanny? What if you all this stuff?
Yeah, it's about social supports for the parent-child relationship. So either, you know, the parent can try their hardest in spite of this experience they're having, and or there can be other people that step in around that parent-child unit to kind of help make sure those serve and return interactions are happening. Yeah. So all that is to say is there's a ton of evidence to show that those things are toxic to children's development. One of the things that we see as an outcome of those experiences is epigenetic changes. So children's gene expression is different when they have these exposures to toxic stressors versus children who don't. And the literature shows that those epigenetic changes are related to things like behavioral problems and even.
From what ages are we seeing gene expression changes?
Very young. So,
and how do you measure that?
So that's what I'm going to get to. This is the most exciting thing I think that we're working on right now in my lab, is so we had seen other people, neuroscientists, you know, primate scientists and stuff like that, actually looking at how early experiences affect gene expression. There's a huge number of people in Canada and internationally that are doing that work. So and you can see it really early on, right? And those gene expressions changes are linked to things like inflammation over the lifespan and mental health problems over the lifespan. Okay, so that's an established kind of playing field that we're in. And so my own research has been looking at how we can intervene with families to actually checking to see if we can change or protect the children's gene expression. So in this trial we did with an agency here in town called Discovery House. It's a shelter for women when they've fled violent situations. We delivered this program to these mothers and their children who were like between, newborn and about 3 years of age. And we implemented this program. It's called ATTACH, standing for Attachment and Child Health. And essentially, we work with the parents every week for 10 weeks, and we help them tune into their babies and their young children. Help them recognize cues and respond to them. And so essentially, we're working on serve and return relationships in spite of this exposure to this family violence, this toxic stressor, which we know, and children are exposed to. Family violence is almost one of the worst of all those toxic stressors. It seems to be the most profoundly impactful. So these kids are at risk. And so what we did, we looked at the children's gene expression, and we compared that gene expression in the kids who had the program to kids who didn't have the program. Okay? And what we found is that the kids who had the program, like actually their parents have the program, the kids are just, living their lives with their parents. But the kids whose parents had the program had gene expression that was better in the sense that it was related to downregulation of inflammatory responses. So we saw the kids, so long story short is the kids whose parents had the program had downregulated gene expression related to inflammation, whereas the kids who didn't have the program had the same propensity, had a higher propensity for inflammatory disorders related to their gene expression.
And take me back to how you're measuring that. And then I have a couple follow-up questions. How you're measuring gene expression.
Yeah. Well, in this study, we use something called the conserved transcriptional, it's CTRA. I can't remember what it stands for exactly, but conserved transcriptional risk for adversity, I think is what it stands for.
Yeah.
And it's a set of genes that are, that change. There's been demonstrated, there's work that has demonstrated that these genes change their expression when there's been a lot of stress in the child's life.
Let's say you're 5 years old. And you measure this set of genes. And then you have two individuals. One faces extreme adversity, violence, abuse, all the rest. One who doesn't. This person's genes at the age of 10 would express differently?
Yes.
And you could test that?
Yes. Yeah.
You visualize it?
Yeah. And I mean, and this work doesn't come out of my lab. Like, we're just using the work.
Yeah.
But it comes out of a UCLA lab that's run by a guy named Steve Cole, who's quite an amazing, scientist down in the U.S. And so we're using his tool that he developed to examine impacts of our ATTACH intervention on this CTRA, which is linked to gene expression, changes when you've had adversity. And I have to just say, shout out to my colleague Kara Ross, who actually was my postdoc and now an outstanding independent scholar who helped get this work done. So, yeah. And
do these different types of genes express throughout your whole life? Like 20 to 30, 30 to 70.
The interesting thing about gene expression is that it does seem it's impacted by the environment, right? That's kind of the what's so interesting about epigenetic change. So, but it seems like, and I don't actually know the answer. If these genes, we have shown in our own research that if you change the environment, the propensity of these genes to be expressed is less. So potentially over time, there's still possibility for resilience if you can change the environments and improve the environments. But I'm not sure at what point that might cease to be operating.
It seems to be like a test for resilience.
Oh, I know. It's fascinating, isn't it? Yeah. And that's actually what we're trying to promote is resilience in these kids. We're trying to protect them so that...
and you can measure it.
Yeah.
You could say, hey, that there's like out of the whatever genetic expression scale you have, this young person is potentially less resilient than this person.
Yeah.
Is it there yet?
Yeah. Well...
or does the science not want to go there?
Well, there is another whole, it's genetic, and there's another whole area of research that it gets at this, actually. So far I've been talking to you about epigenetic kind of stuff. And
what is epigenetic?
So epigenetic is when when the gene's expression is changed given an environmental exposure, but the underlying genotype does not change.
And the gene is, what's a gene? Just back us up there.
What's a gene? So, well, we all have this genetic code, and it encodes everything that we have or do, like our hair color, eye color, how tall we're going to be. A bunch of genes will kind of contribute to that. So there are genes that code for proteins that relate to our phenotype, right? And they don't change. But what does change is whether some genes can be turned on or off, which is really interesting. And I know, of course, I'm not an expert in this, but that's what cancer is all about, right? Yeah. It's an epigenetic it's an exposure that changes a gene so that it reproduces too much,
Creates a blueprint for a protein that can create a tumor or create a muscle cell or in this case, I imagine it's like brain cell.
Yeah, brain cells. Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
And I mean, it's quite complex, right? I mean, we have focused in on a few genes and their expression. That's what the CTRA is. In some of my other research, we've looked at methylation, which is different than the CTRA gene expression profile.
It's a different way.
It's a different way of
genes.
measuring gene expression. So methylation is just a methyl group, which is a chemical tag which gets applied to a gene and turns it off. Okay, so so DNA methylation you might have heard about, but that's when people think of gene expression and epigenetics, they tend to think of DNA methylation. But the CTRA study I was just talking about with our attach intervention wasn't exactly that, but it falls in that whole area of epigenetics. So we've been doing other work, which I think is really interesting too, in how parents, and there's something really, we haven't quite figured this out yet, and I'm hoping other people will, but we found that parents own adverse childhood experiences, exposures, so their exposures as children under 18 to those toxic stressors actually predicts DNA methylation changes in their offspring. And even more interestingly, it seems to be more powerful, at least in my own research, more powerful in dads than in mothers. So fathers own adverse childhood experiences. You can see somehow predicts changes in the DNA methylation, the gene expression of their children.
So let's say I had an adverse childhood experience as a father that puts my kid at risk of expressing or not expressing genes that could make him less resilient.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the things we found is that it impacted sleep, for example, or behavior. Those genes were linked to behavior and sleep.
Do we know
Isn't that
if it's
interesting?
like this? So you're bringing to light the idea of intergenerational trauma.
Yeah, exactly.
And that has it been traced to grandparents and great grandparents?
Yeah. Well, some people have done, and I haven't myself, but these epigenetic changes, which are what you see in the next generation, we don't know if it's because of physiologic changes to the genotype of the parents that are somehow passed on in some way we don't understand. Because epigenetically, when the sperm fertilizes the egg, the epigenome was wiped clean. None of the parents' methylation tags remain. It's all wiped clean. So it's like this is for some other scientists to figure out how it transmits. But we certainly do know that risks for offspring in a whole variety of outcomes relate to the kind of exposures of parents and grandparents. So that intergenerational trauma kind of stuff.
Like in high school, we're always taught like Mendelian genetics.
Yeah.
And then there's the other guy, is it Lamarckian? And we're like, what a guy.
Yeah, no, Lamarck.
Like,
He
could you imagine?
has the last laugh. Yeah.
But this guy, this Lamarckian genetics
something.
is a thing.
It is
like you can
something,
change your gene expression.
Yeah.
As
exactly.
you...
Like, I don't think you can make your neck grow longer like a giraffe or something.
The giraffe was the example.
That was always the example.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, we do know that we are much more plastic as humans than it was laid out to us. And I vividly remember when I realized this, because I'm interested in nature and nurture and what it is like that predicts outcomes in one kid versus another. And when I remember when I realized that epigenetics was a thing, I was like, oh, wow.
It's incredible.
Yeah. And the other thing that is really, speaking to your point about resilience, the other thing that's really interesting is gene-environment interactions, because there are certain genes. I don't know if you've heard of the orchid and dandelion metaphors before, but there are certain genes that do associate more with resilience than others. But the interesting thing about them is it depends on the environment that you're in. So they talk about this orchid genotype and a dandelion genotype. So the dandelion genotype, those kids, broadly speaking, will do pretty well regardless of the quality of the serve and return they have with their parents or the kind of stressors they experience. They kind of just do pretty well. They're like that dandelion that will grow in the crack of the sidewalk or in a lush green at a golf
dandelion
course. Okay, you know what I mean? Like, or so,
forest.
In the most perfect conditions. And then the orchid genotype is a child, and I find this very interesting because they used to just think these were risk genes because they only looked at kids that were growing up in vulnerable conditions. And these particular genes, like the MAO, you might have heard of some of these, DRD2, like the dopamine gene or the MAO gene system, and they when they looked at kids in vulnerable situations, if you had certain alleles or polymorphisms in these genes, these kids are more likely to do very poorly. Okay, but then Scientists started to look at the other side, which is kids that are growing up in very high quality environments where there's lots of good quality serve and return, there's no toxic stress, and they're, have parents that are supportive and so on. Those same genotypes make for very outstanding, more successful kids than normal. They are, they have good pro-social skills, they do well in school, they don't have mental health problems. So the same genotype reacts to the environment. It's a very reactive genotype, right? So
there's one that will do well, but they may not be a shooting star or an orchid, but they'll do relatively well in all environments. Yeah. There's another, and I know it's not a dichotomy, but there's another set of genes that will be expressed with a kid who, like, with all the right elements, will do extremely well.
They do very well.
But with a couple of bad elements, will do very poorly.
Yeah. So, the orchid metaphor was what's used to describe that kind of child. So, an orchid who's got just the right humidity and the right sunlight and the right soil, whatever, they do very well. But, if you're a terrible gardener, that orchid won't do so well. So I'm really fascinated by that stuff too. And we've been looking at that stuff in my lab and, found, that the quality of serve and return interactions with children does interact with certain genotypes in predicting likelihood of mental health, behavioral problems in children early on. So we've been looking at that. But the science is moving so fast, and I actually, I'm applied. Like I'm interested in interventions and seeing if they work and for whom they work. So I don't do the basic science, but the science has moved right on, and now they're looking at like gene networks. So it's not just orchid and dandelion genes, a few particular genes, but it's networks, and they're talking about polygenic risk scores and stuff like that. So we're trying to embed that in our research.
I imagine that like it has skewed the research, not based on what genes that are the most expressive or the most relevant for that phenotype or that characteristic, but what genes we can actually measure and we understand.
Yeah.
Which kind of like, it's like searching in a dark room with a spotlight, and you find something. It might not be the right thing, but you find something, so you're searching for that.
Yeah. And I mean, like this is definitely moving outside of my expertise, but I know people that are doing work in this area, and they're looking at genes expressed in certain parts of the brain, and these networks of genes and how those networks of genes interact with environments and predicting outcomes. And they're finding some really interesting things, but it's kind of hard to, it's early days yet, and I think anyway, and it's a little hard to use some of those more novel, interesting, they're even AI-dependent tools, right, to examine impacts of intervention. But for me, if I just kind of go back to what I think is most exciting, is that we are able to show that we can change environments and help parents be more sensitive and responsive, have those better serve and return interactions with their children, in spite of all these risks, in spite of depression, in spite of family violence. And we see improvements in their children with respect to gene expression, and I didn't mention, but we also see improvements in their child's development and the child's behavior and the security of attachment their child demonstrates, and the executive function the child has. So we're pretty excited about that stuff.
There's more, like you always hear about like the first 5 for the rest of their life, or like the first couple of years are the most important. Does the data still support that?
Yeah, to my knowledge, it does. I mean, they are super important periods in development. That's not to say that intervention can't, or supportive help, whatever the situation is, that's some kind of support to address the situation, the mental health issue or whatever that's showing up in adolescence or even early adulthood. It's not to say that can't help, or a good relationship can't help, to help a person who's had a struggling early childhood to be successful and resilient. But the impacts of intervention are less over time. Like, this is what all the policymakers continue to kind of emphasize. Well, people are resilient until, and even, brains are plastic until early 30s. And there's always hope. You get your biggest impacts if you are preventing or addressing stressors and risks early in life.
Wow.
Definitely.
And so you're getting less return on upskilling after you're 40 and 50. Like you're not the delta is not as big for that resilience.
There's some interesting things like exercise. It's, if you're thinking of brain and neuroplasticity as one of the solutions to the recovery from whatever stress the person's had in early life, exercise and even antidepressants and stuff like that seem to have an impact on on neuroplasticity. So even beyond 30s, you never can give up hope.
Yeah.
But it's just that it's so much easier for everyone, avoiding so much suffering and promoting better health and developmental outcomes for children. It's good for societies. If you want to have successful societies with income, income earning, tax paying citizens that aren't struggling with mental health problems, you want to intervene and prevent as much as you can early on.
Did COVID disrupt that? Like when we look at the data in 10 years, are we going to see like bad gene expression because of that?
Yeah, I'm not saying that myself, but yeah, I have colleagues that are, especially around pregnancy. I'll be very curious to see what they come up with. Yeah, there's all kinds of evidence from other like similar kind of crises, like the Quebec ice storms. There's been studies looking at women who were pregnant during the Quebec ice storms.
Oh, interesting.
Or even going a long way back, the Dutch famine during World War II. They've looked at outcomes in the children who were exposed to those sorts of things, and they see epigenetic change for sure in the Quebec ice storm data in children associated with those early exposures. And in the Dutch famine, they see all kinds of interesting, like kids who were fetuses during the Dutch famine are more likely to have schizophrenia and stuff like that. Which interesting. So definitely there's evidence to show from other kind of similarly stressful crises that those early exposures have a lot to say about how someone will develop and the health they have over their life.
The interventions that you study and deploy are for like parents for their 0 to 5 year olds.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the focus.
Yeah.
Although one of my colleagues says this stuff could be working for everyone, but we haven't gotten there yet. We're too busy just testing our interventions for
But that's the question. Could it work for everyone though?
Well, this attach intervention that we are having such great success with, and I really can't, it's such a positive intervention, and parents seem to really like it. It's different than other parenting programs too, because other parenting programs seem to assume that parents have like a deficit. We have to teach you things. You have to do things differently.
Yeah.
Whereas what we focus on there is we help parents be more reflective. So we have them think about what's their child thinking and feeling. What are you thinking and feeling? And everyone has that ability. So we just kind of give people a chance to just practice it for an hour a week. And when you practice thinking about what someone else thinks and feels, you end up being a more sensitive parent, or in your relationships, more attuned to your partner's needs, wants, whatever. Or even if you're going to the grocery store, that you've noticed the stress of the cashier or whatever. It just so. My colleagues who deliver the intervention think it could work. We should be looking at how it impacts other relationships too. So
lots of work to do.
Yeah.
I imagine that though there's a social reciprocity is a skill, and we know that if you have, let's say, autism, you're less socially reciprocal.
Yeah.
Is there research in that with kids of that demographic?
Yeah. That's a group I'd really like to do some work with, and I haven't done it yet. I bet you I will before I retire. But I was approached by some AHS colleagues a few years ago. I'm trying to think of the guy's name. He's a physician here in Alberta, and he treats or helps families with young children who have autism. And I'm totally blanking. But anyway, and he and some others have done some work around providing this intensive kind of parenting support to parents who have children with autism. So you have a first child with autism, and your second child's at risk, right? So if the second child is presenting with like not making eye contact and stuff like that early on, there's some research done that shows that early intervention with the second child, when it's intensive and it's about teaching parents how to be more sensitive and responsive to these kids, it actually prevents the second children from going on to be diagnosed with autism in randomized controlled trials. So I know that they were doing some of that work here in Alberta very similarly. They're just doing it in practice. And I remember being approached by a bunch of nurses and social workers in AHS, and they kind of made a joke about how they were curing autism, because while kids were on the waiting list to get into their program, they were giving them this intensive parenting support. And by the time the kids saw the physician, the symptoms had abated.
Yeah.
Isn't that fascinating? So, I think that for some kids, autism has a, multifactorial causes. But for some kids, it seems as though intensive social reciprocity kind of stuff, to use your term, teaching parents how to really tune into kids who just maybe harder tuned into, or they're maybe genetically they have some risk factors that put them in a position where they don't just naturally attune. So you have to kind of work more intensely with them. Anyway, it seems to actually help a lot of kids.
That's interesting
who are
because
at risk of autism.
There's such a it's a pretty deeply embedded construct that there's some things that are so genetically hardwired that it's not responsive to social or psychological interventions, but you're saying quite the opposite.
Well, I mean, and autism is a spectrum, right?
Sure.
So there could be some proportion of kids on that spectrum that are very amenable to this kind of intervention, and some kids who aren't. But why not try? Why not try? I mean, I think always some of the drawbacks of that kind of approach is that, you need to be very sensitive and careful with parents so they don't feel blamed, It's not because of your parenting. There's some interaction there, right? Something about this child means that they need more of than what another child might need, right? So there's always that kind of risk, and you don't want parents to feel blamed. We know most parents do the best they can all the time.
Yeah, and I mean, it serves... it really shines a light on how important these early interventions are, and there's like strong genetic evidence behind it. That makes it very interesting. And then also kind of parenting. I tend to believe that you don't really get much improvement on children's or youth mental health without involving parents.
Oh God, that's what I think too. But that's not very common opinion, though.
Is that right?
Yeah. I'm always having, in every setting I'm in, I feel like I'm frequently having to advocate for, it's not just treating the child's symptoms, it's treating the context. And I think that's challenging for some parents. On the other hand, some parents really want to be engaged and they want to be part of the solution or whatever. But for some parents, it's fix my child. But I think a lot of the time it's a dynamic. And that's hard. I don't work with adolescents, and I respect people that do, because I think it's that much more challenging where the adolescent's presenting with a mental health issue, and it needs that symptom, whatever that presentation needs treatment, but also the parents need to be engaged, ideally. And they're not always. And they may not want to. It might be challenging for healthcare providers to also want to engage with them around, a whole variety of issues. So, but yeah, absolutely. Mental health happens in the context of relationships. Everything is in the context of relationships, and I think we ignore it at our peril.
What's your next project? Where are you taking this field?
Well,
if you have to pick one.
Yeah, really. We've got a lot of things that we're trying to do. We've taken our attach intervention and turned it into an app, because it used to be delivered one-on-one, and it still is in person like this. But we piloted this app that we've developed with my colleague Linda Duffett-Legier at University of Calgary. We've developed an app to interact with parents over their phone or desktop or laptop computer to deliver the program. So we're hoping to get some funding for that. We have another program for depressed mothers. It's called VidKids, and we developed an app for that too. The pilot work showed it to be very positive, and that intervention is really interesting. It's about serve and return again. They're all a little bit different in their approach. This is a 3-session intervention with a public health nurse. We made it shorter because we'd love to see Alberta Health Services nurses and public health be able to deliver it, and the government to see that it's feasible and effective and not too expensive, So we've shown that intervention actually reduces children's cortisol levels. So their stress hormones are less when their mothers get that intervention. So we've taken that online. We're hoping to get funding to scale and spread that. I have this big health research training platform that I've gotten funding for. It's called AVA. It stands for the Alliance Against Violence and Adversity. And we have about 200 partners across the country. And essentially what I'm trying to do with all these partners is change how training is done for graduate students of any stripe, any discipline or field. We're trying to change it so that when a graduate student or a postdoctoral fellow gets out into the world to practice their craft, their discipline, that they're going to want to do it with community organizations. They're going to want to do research with community organizations, because the interventions I'm describing, they happen in community organizations. There's all kinds of research dollars and training focused on hospital care and people that are sick. and kids that are sick and whatever. But a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about, and I think is really important if you want to improve outcomes for kids at risk, happens in communities. It happens in the Family Resource Center in your neighborhood.
Yeah.
You know, and so we want to work with all those. We're working with all these partners across the country who deliver these sorts of services, social services. You know, they're staffed by nurses and social workers and psychologists, and they might have a physician come in and do primary health care or whatever. But we're working with all of those organizations, as many as we can, across the country to help change how training is done in the country and change how services are delivered in the country so that an organization wouldn't feel comfortable delivering a program or service unless they knew there was an evidence base for that program. It worked for kids. Like, wouldn't that be nice to know if it worked before you delivered it or as you're delivering it? So
it's
that's
crucial.
That's the big thing I'm focusing on right now. It's called AVA.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate your research. It's incredible, very interesting, so applicable to what we do day in, day out. And we're thinking about ways more and more and how we can, like, I mean, we work mostly with employees. We're trying to figure out ways how we can make an impact with younger demographics and their parents with our technology. So I think we have a lot to talk about. And thanks for coming by the studio and having a conversation about it. It's really incredible work.
Oh, great. I appreciate the opportunity. And I just remembered there's other study I should tell you about, but maybe you can invite me back to talk about
maybe
that
we'll have
one.
a part 2. That's awesome. Well, thanks for coming by.
Yeah, I appreciate it. It's been great.
Very cool.
Went fast.